Hello and welcome back to another video. This is the third video in this little series of camera settings for beginners. Today we're going to be covering the setting called ISO. So ISO is essentially a digital brightening of an image. There's a lot of science that goes into it and a lot of information you can garner from the internet or from other people about it. But the simplest way to approach it, I think, is by imagining a brightness slider when you're editing a photo for Instagram or social media. Because essentially, as you increase your ISO, the image gets brighter, and as you decrease your ISO, the image gets darker. The more you increase this ISO, the worse your image will become. And therein lies kind of the unique quality of ISO. It's a little bit different from shutter speed and aperture, as it's not really a physical feature of the camera. And because of this, the kind of effects that come along with increasing your ISO are actually all arguably detrimental. But to keep this relatively structured, we'll begin with kind of just the numbers that denote ISO. ISO is going to be seen as a number in the hundreds. So you'll see ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, 800, 1600, 3200, so on and so forth. You'll notice that these numbers are doubling each time they go up. Likewise, the exposure will actually double every time you double the ISO. Most cameras, however, will allow you to turn on a setting that lets you choose ISOs between these numbers. So let's say instead of 100 or 200, you can choose ISO 160. Instead of 400 or 800, you can choose ISO 640. So again, the primary function of ISO is to increase the brightness of your image or video. If you raise your ISO, you increase the brightness. A lower ISO will be a darker image. But I guess the most important part are these so-called side effects of a higher ISO. These effects can include a loss of detail, a change in color, a loss of dynamic range, as well as digital noise. And of these, I guess digital noise would be the most important to consider. What is it? Digital noise is essentially a whole bunch of little specks that vary in brightness and color. It's kind of like the visual representation of static in TV or radio. So when we see an image with a lot of these little specks, we call it a very noisy image. Now in film photography, these specks were called grain, but often they added texture to an image and looked very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. In digital photography, this hasn't been the case, and most people will agree that digital noise has never looked very good. As a result, we want to avoid this as much as possible, and we want to shoot at lower ISOs. And for the most part, cameras agree with us as well. You'll see that if you take an image at a higher ISO, a camera will try to compensate for this and correct this. In doing so, however, the camera introduces these other effects that we want to avoid. Loss of detail, for example, is a result of the camera trying to smoothen out these little specks. By smoothing out these specks, however, we lose a little bit of texture, we lose a little bit of sharpness, and overall the image can become very mushy looking. Cameras also often hide this other effect caused by a high ISO, chroma noise or color noise. As the name implies, it's just kind of noise that is very strongly colored. So in this image, you'll see that in the shadows, there's a lot of noise, and a lot of this noise looks very purple. If we see the image that the camera produces, however, we'll notice that this color has been corrected for, and that is no longer in the image. And as a side note, this is the camera producing a file called a JPEG. The image we saw before was a raw image. So if you hear photographers talking about shooting in raw or JPEG, this is what they're referring to. The JPEG is the camera corrected image, and the raw is actually what the camera captured. And at first glance, you might think, oh, the JPEG is much better, but ultimately shooting in raw just allows you that extra flexibility that allows you to control how much do you want to correct for this problem. Let's say that a camera overcorrects for digital noise and makes the image too soft looking and very mushy looking. If you shot that photo in RAW, then you can kind of fine tune it so that it doesn't look as mushy. But back to ISO, the next effect is a loss of dynamic range. So this might be new info to you. Dynamic range is essentially the range of information that is being captured in your image from the darkest part of the image to the brightest part of the image. We often refer to these darker parts as shadows and the brighter parts as highlights. So the range of information from the darkest of your shadows and the brightest of your highlights, that is your dynamic range. So oftentimes when we take photos or videos of something in real life and it looks absolutely gorgeous when we see it in person, but the photo or video just doesn't seem to stand up to it, this is most likely due to the fact that your camera has a lesser dynamic range. Perhaps the easiest way to see this though is if you're taking a photograph of something in front of a window. In this photo, for example, I'm shooting my cat and I'm trying to expose for my cat. You'll notice that the windows have completely blown out. They're completely white. You can't see anything outside. On the other hand, if I try to expose for outside, then my cat becomes completely dark and I can't see anything. This is an illustration of the limitations of dynamic range. So relating this to ISO, lower ISOs will yield the best dynamic range. As you raise your ISO, this range becomes smaller and you'll lose detail in either your shadows or highlights. You have to choose between the two. So for dynamic range and just image quality in general in photography, is relatively straightforward. You just want to shoot as low as possible. And the lowest ISO is often referred to as the base ISO. And the base ISO for most cameras is either 100 or 200. Some cameras do offer lower ISOs, let's say 64 or 80, but these are often simulated ISOs, and it's best to just consider them fake ISOs and more of a last resort. The reason for this being that it usually degrades your image. Now on the video side of things, ISO becomes a little bit more interesting, especially when it comes to dynamic range. Depending on the camera you have and depending on the mode that you're shooting in, the base ISO may change. For example, if you've picked up an EOS R or a Sony camera or a Fujifilm camera, you might notice something called a log mode or a log profile. And these profiles allow you kind of extra dynamic range, so to speak, or just looks flatter and more cinematic. But the caveats with them is that they come with a higher base ISO. So for the Canon EOS R, shooting a C-Log means my base ISO becomes 400. So why is that important? Different cameras will have different base ISOs, meaning that you don't always shoot for ISO 100 or ISO 200. Sometimes you'll have to shoot at ISO 400 to get the best results, and shooting at ISO 100 will actually yield a worse result. The other time that this becomes important is shooting outdoors in direct sunlight where it's very bright. If your base ISO becomes 400, 500 or higher, then you'll have to compensate for that in other means such as aperture or perhaps an ND filter. And other cameras such as the one I'm filming on will have something called dual native ISOs. And essentially this means that I have two ISOs that will result in the cleanest looking image and the least amount of noise. Now in terms of dynamic range and all of these different base ISOs or dual native ISOs and whatnot, this means that each ISO technically yields a different dynamic range. And this is something you have to play around with your camera because each camera is a little bit different. I would highly recommend researching what the ideal ISO for video is for your particular camera. For the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, at ISO 400 you'll get much better dynamic range than at 1250. ISO 1250 is a lot cleaner than ISO 1000, but apparently you do sacrifice dynamic range. Now this is a lot of extra confusing information. You don't necessarily need to know all of this. The point I'm trying to make is that ISO can become very finicky, and the best way to understand ISO and your particular camera is to research your particular camera and the effects of ISO on it. For most consumer cameras though, whether it be photo or video, shooting at ISO 100 or 200 will be your best bet. Okay, so I think that's probably enough information about all of that. Let's quickly revisit that scenario that we ended the last video with. Let's say you're trying to shoot photos of your kids or your cats like me. Your aperture is set so that you can have a decent amount of depth of field, and shutter speed has been set to get rid of motion blur that you don't want. But your image is still too dark. So now ISO comes in, you start at 100, go up to 200, go to 400, and then fine tune it from there. So I'd probably start at ISO 100 and continue to raise it up until it becomes bright enough. And that's really it. You just repeat this until it becomes second nature. The more you practice shooting images according to these different settings and begin to really understand all the effects of these settings, you won't have to approach an image in terms of any particular order. For example, the example I gave you is aperture, then shutter speed, then ISO. But once it becomes second nature, you really don't have to go in that order. You can start with ISO, figure out your aperture, then your shutter speed, or you might even just begin to have certain ideas in different scenes. These are the settings that I'll shoot in this type of scene I'll shoot in these settings. It becomes less of a calculation and more just a reaction. But one final question you might have is how high can you go with your ISO? A lot of cameras will offer ISO values that go past 20,000, past even 50,000, but in short, just because it's there, it doesn't mean that you should shoot that high. And this really depends on how old your camera is and maybe a couple of different factors such as sensor size. But people will generally say ISO 1600 is clean across the board. Anything past that, especially from ISO 3200, it kind of becomes a subjective thing. Some people will be okay with the amount of noise that is introduced into the image. Other people will say that's unacceptable. I myself, I haven't really been a stickler for it, but I do generally want to avoid shooting past ISO 6400, whether it be photo or video. So again, with this, it's just one of those things where you have to keep practicing and make that decision yourself. What are your tastes? Do you prefer an image that has zero noise, or are you okay with a noisier image? Is that something you want to always have in your images? These are little questions that come up the more you shoot. And that's it. I know that there's a lot of information in this video and a lot of stuff that might not apply to you, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how much stuff that there is to work on. And this is not something that is as simple as just pressing a button. And the reason I say that is not because people are downplaying photography or anything like that. It's just that I think thinking about it in that sort of manner will give you more appreciation for what you're learning and what you're picking up. I think learning photography, I think learning videography are both beautiful things to add to your life. Not the technical aspect of it, but what it can do for you. It can really capture very key moments in your lives and certain moments of emotion that you will more easily recall because you have it actually documented in the form of a photograph or a video. But that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you've watched the entire series, more videos will be coming. There's probably a whole bunch of things that I've missed and will address in future videos. And eventually I want to start doing videos that are more targeted toward intermediate shooters. So in the meantime, please go out and shoot, practice with your camera, become familiar with these settings. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful night.